All right, let's jump right into it. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today, we're tackling 19th century America.
Specifically, the years 1817 to 1860, a period of immense transformation. You could say it's like America's coming-of-age story.
Ooh, I like that. Figuring out its identity, dealing with growing pains, and setting the stage for the country we know today. And we're basing this deep dive on excerpts from, well, it looks like a history textbook chapter. Lots to unpack here.
Absolutely. It's not just about battles and presidents, it's about understanding how everyday life changed for Americans, how they lived, worked, traveled, even what they did for fun.
Okay, so let's dive in. First up, population. The U.S. population just absolutely exploded during this time, but not evenly, right?
Right. Westward expansion definitely played a part, but there's more to it. Public health was improving, fewer epidemics, people living longer, and that impacts everything. White women were averaging over 6 children each.
6 kids. Wow, that's a lot of diapers. But hold on. If public health was getting better, why didn't African Americans see the same population boom?
That's a crucial point. Sadly, African Americans still face much higher death rates. The conditions they lived in were often just incredibly harsh. It's a reminder that progress wasn't, it wasn't for everyone. And speaking of new arrivals, we can't forget immigration. A massive wave of immigrants came pouring in, largely driven by, well, famine and unrest in Europe. Steamships made transatlantic travel more affordable and faster, so.
It was like suddenly coming to America was possible for so many more people.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this population boom, but where are all these people going?
Cities, mainly, especially in the Northeast, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. Their populations exploded. Imagine the hustle and bustle, the constant change, a real clash of cultures as all these immigrants arrived.
It's like those time-lapse videos you see, where a tiny village turns into a sprawling metropolis in seconds.
Yeah.
Mind-boggling. But wait, wasn't the South still mostly rural at this time?
That's a common misconception, actually. The South didn't urbanize at the same rate as the North, true, but it was still urbanizing. It was a nationwide trend. And even the West. You see little villages and trading posts transforming into these bustling hubs like St. Louis or Chicago.
The map of America was literally being redrawn.
It really was.
And in some cities, get this, foreign-born residents actually outnumbered native-born residents.
Wow.
I can only imagine what the social dynamics were like.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
So who exactly were these people flocking to the cities?
2 groups really dominated, the Irish and the Germans. But their reasons for coming and their experiences once they got here, totally different.
Give me the rundown.
Okay, so the Irish, they were fleeing desperate circumstances, poverty, British rule, and then the potato famine hit. Devastating. Many arrived with practically nothing, desperate for work.
Starting from scratch in a new country must have been incredibly difficult.
It was. They often ended up in factories or as domestic servants, a lot of the unskilled labor force.
Right.
Now, the Germans. They often came with a bit more resources, and often as families. Tended to head northwest. They were looking to establish farms, businesses.
So different goals, different impact on the country. Fascinating.
Exactly. It's interesting how 2 groups, arriving at roughly the same time, could have such different paths.
Did this difference in backgrounds, lead to any tension?
No, absolutely. This huge influx of immigrants, especially Irish, sparked a backlash from those who saw them as a threat. Nativism started to rise. You had groups like the Native American Party.
Which is kind of ironic, right? It wasn't about Native American rights at all.
Nope. It was all about limiting the influence of immigrants. They eventually morphed into the Know-Nothings. You've heard of them.
Yeah, but I always pictured them as sort of this fringe group. Were they really that influential?
More than you might think. They wanted to ban Catholics and aliens from holding office, stricter naturalization laws, literacy tests for voting. Sound familiar?
Whoa. Yeah, a little too familiar.
It shows that anxiety about immigration, about jobs and political power, it's not new. It's been around for a while.
So amidst all this social and political upheaval, how were people even getting around? It's not like they could just hop on a plane or even a train, right?
Right. Cross-country travel was no walk in the park back then. Early 1800s, America relied heavily on roads. And you can imagine...
Bumpy.
Exactly. Often impassable in bad weather. Not exactly a smooth ride. So that's where canals come in.
Canals.
The Erie Canal, that was huge. A monumental engineering feat connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. Made it way easier and cheaper to transport goods and people.
Okay, so canals were a game changer. But what about railroads? Weren't they starting to come onto the scene around this time.
Oh, absolutely. And once the railroads arrived, it was like hitting fast forward on progress. By 1860, there were over 27,000 miles of railroad track, mostly concentrated in the Northeast. Chicago became this rail hub of the West. Imagine the impact. Goods and people moving at unprecedented speeds, new towns popping up along these rail lines.
The economy transforming right before your eyes.
Exactly.
So transportation wasn't just about getting around faster. It sounds like it reshaped the entire fabric of society.
It did. You hit the nail on the head there. It's not just how people traveled, it's where they lived, what they could buy, even how they worked. It's crazy how a seemingly simple technological advancement.
Can have these huge ripple effects across everything.
It's true. But let's not forget another groundbreaking innovation in communication, the telegraph.
Ah, the telegraph. Before this, if you wanted to communicate with someone far away, you basically had to rely on letters.
Which could take weeks or months to arrive.
Talk about a snail's pace.
Right. So that's where Samuel F.B. Morse comes in. He saw how you could use electricity to transmit messages, developed Morse code, that system of dots and dashes representing letters. His aha moment, it wasn't just about speed, it was about connecting people across huge distances like never before.
It's mind-blowing to think about how this invention paved the way for the instant communication we have today.
I know, right?
We take it for granted now, but
By 1860, over 50,000 miles of telegraph wire were crisscrossing the country. And then, in 1866, the first transatlantic cable was laid,
hold on, a cable running under the entire Atlantic Ocean.
connecting America and Europe through, well, practically instantaneous communication.
That is insane. What an engineering feat.
Extraordinary.
And all this instant communication wasn't just for chit-chat, right? It revolutionized business, too.
Oh, yeah. Faster deals, faster news, faster everything. A huge impact on the economy. Which actually...
Good segue. Let's talk about that next.
Let's do it. By the mid-19th century, America was well on its way to becoming a modern capitalist economy.
Yeah, a real industrial powerhouse.
Yeah.
But this economic boom, it wasn't exactly, a tide that lifted all boats. We've talked about the struggles faced by immigrants, African Americans.
You're absolutely right. The overall average income was rising, true, but the gap between the rich and the poor, that was widening too. It's a pattern we see, well, throughout history, really. Rapid economic growth, often it comes with increased inequality.
So we're seeing the seeds of economic inequality being sown, seeds that, unfortunately, are still bearing fruit today.
Yeah. In the early 1800s, most businesses were small, personal. But as the century went on, we see corporations starting to emerge. And that changes things.
Corporations. Didn't those already exist? What was so different about them during this period?
Well, it's not that they were brand new, but they were evolving. They allowed businesses to pool resources from multiple shareholders, right? So suddenly you could fund much larger, more ambitious ventures. And the concept of limited liability emerged, where investors only risked the amount they put in.
So less risky for wealthy individuals to invest in these big ventures, which of course fueled even more economic growth, but maybe at the expense of the working class.
Yeah, and this shift towards bigger, more complex businesses, it went hand in hand with the rise of factories.
Ah, the factories, a real symbol of this era. Is this when we see the transition from small-scale production to mass production?
Exactly. Before the War of 1812, most manufacturing was done in homes, small workshops. But with the rise of water-powered machinery, textile mills in New England started bringing all their operations under one roof. The factory system was born.
And I bet that model just spread like wildfire to other industries.
It did.
It's amazing how technology can just completely revolutionize how work gets done. But this shift to factories, it must have had a huge impact on where people lived, how they worked.
It did. It drew workers from rural areas into the cities, fueled the growth of cities even more. The Northeast, that really became the heart of American manufacturing. Over half the factories, nearly 3/4 of manufacturing workers were all concentrated there.
So the Northeast is becoming this industrial powerhouse. But hold on, who were the people at the top leading this industrial revolution?
Well, in the early 1840s, the big players were the merchant capitalists, the folks who controlled the shipping lines, the trade routes, all that. But as British competition increased and manufacturing became more profitable, a new breed emerged, the industrial capitalists.
Ooh, the new kids on the block.
Yeah, they were the ones financing the factories, driving innovation, shaping the economic landscape.
So they were the new elite, the new aristocracy of the Northeast. Did they basically push the old merchant class out of the way?
Not necessarily pushed out, but their influence definitely declined. The source of wealth was shifting from trade to manufacturing. These new industrialists, they amassed huge fortunes, and with that came, well, a lot of economic and political power.
Fortunes rising and falling during this time of immense change. It's incredible. But let's shift focus a bit. From the wealthy industrialists to the everyday workers. Where were all these factories finding people to, actually operate the machines? Wasn't most of the population still rural at this point?
That was a huge challenge. You're right, in the 1820s, most Americans still lived and worked on farms, so finding enough workers for these factories, not easy.
So how did they convince people to leave their farms, come work in these factories?
Different areas tried different strategies. In the mid-Atlantic states, whole families often moved to work in the mills. But up in Massachusetts, New England, they developed the Lowell system.
The Lowell system. I've heard of that. Refresh my memory, though. What exactly was it?
They recruited young, single women, often farmers' daughters, lured them with the promise of decent wages, respectable living conditions, even educational opportunities.
Wait, educational opportunities in a factory town?
Yeah, some factories even had libraries, lecture halls.
Wow. That's not what I pictured when I think of factory life.
I know, right? And get this, in Lowell, Massachusetts, the women working in the mills, they actually published their own literary magazine, the Lowell Offering.
A magazine. That really challenges my assumptions about factory life back then. Was this common, or were these women just exceptional?
The Lowell Offering was definitely unique, but it highlights something that's often overlooked about early factory life. The conditions weren't always, well, as bad as we might think, at least in those early years. The Lowell workers, they had room and board and clean housing, they were well fed, they got pretty good wages for the time. The whole system was designed to attract workers. It was a competitive labor market.
So they weren't just cogs in a machine. They had some agency, some voice. It's interesting. This period is a time of both progress and, exploitation.
That's a great point. And sadly, as demand for workers grew and competition increased, conditions would deteriorate. But that's a story for another deep dive.
Fair enough. So we've got factories popping up, cities growing, a whole new class of industrialists rising to power. But as we've said, this economic prosperity wasn't benefiting everyone equally. Let's talk about that growing gap between the rich and the poor.
Yeah, as much as the economy was booming, wealth distribution was becoming increasingly uneven. Some were amassing these vast fortunes.
While others were struggling just to survive.
Exactly. The contrast was stark. The wealthy, they flaunted their wealth with these lavish mansions, fancy carriages, elaborate social establishments. Central Park, for example. That was basically built as a playground for the New York elite.
I always wondered why Central Park felt so grand. It was designed for the rich to, stroll around in their finery.
Pretty much. Meanwhile, in the same city, poverty was rampant. Many were homeless, relying on charity or, well, turning to crime just to survive. Irish immigrants, they often faced the brunt of it, a lot of prejudice, discrimination.
That's a pretty grim picture, all this inequality alongside all the progress and innovation.
It is.
And what about free blacks in the North? How were they doing during all this?
Well, the North was considered, more progressive than the South on slavery. But life for free blacks was still incredibly challenging. Discrimination in housing, jobs, education. They couldn't vote, attend public schools.
So even though they were free, they were still denied these basic rights.
Yeah. And yet, despite all these hardships, most free blacks still preferred life in the North to the South, which says a lot about the conditions they were escaping.
It's a powerful reminder that freedom, even in the land of the free, was a relative term. But amidst all the struggles of the poor, a new social class was emerging. The middle class. Tell me about them. What set them apart?
The middle class, they were the fastest growing segment of society during this time. They were the shopkeepers, the businessmen, the teachers, the professionals. And their rise showed a real shift. Wealth wasn't just tied to land ownership anymore. You had all these new opportunities in the cities.
So upward mobility was possible. But what did middle class life actually look like? I mean, their homes, their aspirations. Paint me a picture.
Well, they weren't living in those opulent mansions like the super rich, but their homes were definitely larger, more comfortable than, say, working class families. Owning your own home, that became a real marker of middle class success, much like it is today, really. And middle class women, they were still expected to, focus on domestic duties, but they often had the means to hire servants, usually young, unmarried immigrant women.
So a more comfortable life. But still, pretty bound by traditional gender roles. Seems like kind of a contradiction, doesn't it?
It does, but hey, that's the 19th century for you.
Right. Did this whole shift to urban life and this rise of the middle class, did that have any impact on like family structures in general?
Oh, it most certainly did. As families moved from farms to cities, their kids, sons, and daughters, they were more likely to leave home to find work. So, you're not all working together on the family farm anymore. Income earning activities were shifting outside the home, and that created this clear distinction between the public world of work and the private sphere of the family.
Huh. That's a pretty significant shift. It's like the very definition of family was changing.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, I don't know, this is maybe where we see the beginnings of that whole work-life balance struggle we're still dealing with today.
Ooh, good point. It's a theme that, yeah, definitely echoes throughout history. So home became increasingly associated with, the domestic sphere. Women were expected to be the housekeepers, raise the children, manage the household. And we see a significant decline in birth rates during this period, especially among middle-class families in urban areas.
So less time on the farm, more time in the factory or the office, and fewer kids running around.
Right.
It's fascinating how these big societal shifts, they were impacting even the most, I don't know, intimate aspects of people's lives.
It's true. And this separation of spheres, right? Men in the public realm, women in the private, huge implications for gender roles. And that's where this whole idea of the cult of domesticity comes in.
Ah, yes, the cult of domesticity. Sounds kind of ominous, doesn't it? Like secret meetings in dimly lit parlors.
Huh. Well, it wasn't a literal cult, of course. It was more of an ideology, It idealized women as these moral guardians of the home and family, emphasized female virtues like piety, purity, domesticity, all that.
It sounds, I don't know, so restrictive, like putting women on a pedestal, but also kind of trapping them in this very limited sphere.
You're right. It was a double-edged sword. It elevated women's role in the home, yeah. But it also limited their opportunities for education, for public participation. And it's important to remember this ideal of domesticity, it really only applied to middle-class women, working-class women. They often had no choice but to work outside the home, face really harsh conditions in factories, or as domestic servants.
Right, right. Another reminder that even within a social class, experiences could be totally different. Okay, so we've talked about work, family, social class, but what did people do for fun back then? I mean, did they even have a time for leisure with all these changes happening?
Leisure time. That was precious, especially for those working those long hours in factories and mills. Sundays. That was typically the only day off, a much-needed break for rest, religious observance, and socializing.
So Sunday was like the 19th century version of binge-watching Netflix, scrolling through social media.
Huh. That's a funny way to put it. But you're not wrong. Churches, they were often the center of social life,
Yeah.
especially in rural areas.
Makes sense. So beyond religion, how did leisure activities like differ between urban and rural areas? What were people in the big cities doing for fun?
Well, for men, a popular spot was the tavern. For drinks, conversation, games, the 19th century version of the sports bar, I guess you could say.
That makes sense.
Women, they tended to socialize more in each other's homes, tea parties, sewing circles, that sort of thing.
So pretty distinct gender roles, even when it came to leisure. What about entertainment, like beyond the home? Did they have theater, sporting events?
Oh yeah, definitely. Theaters were huge, popular across all social classes. Melodramas, Shakespearean plays, even hilarious parodies. Minstrel shows were also widespread, unfortunately. Those were based on racist caricatures of African Americans.
Right, right. It's a good reminder that even when we look back on the past with a sense of nostalgia, we got to acknowledge the not-so-great parts, too.
Absolutely. But getting back to entertainment, public sporting events were gaining popularity, too. Boxing, horse racing, even early forms of baseball drew big crowds.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
As passionate about their sports as we are today.
Oh, for sure. And no discussion of 19th century entertainment would be complete without mentioning P.T. Barnum.
Yeah.
His famous American Museum, spectacles of oddities, curiosities, later became the Barnum and Bailey Circus.
P.T. Barnum, the ultimate showman. I've always loved those old circus posters, the imagery so over the top. It's amazing how Barnum just tapped into that human desire for spectacle, something that still resonates with us today.
He really understood how to capture the public's imagination. But while we've been focusing on, the excitement of city life, it's important to remember that rural life was a whole different world. And even within rural areas, experiences varied. Farmers in, say, the densely populated East Coast or Old Northwest, they had more chances to connect with their community, churches, schools, social events. But those in the more isolated West, they often struggled with loneliness, less social contact outside their immediate family.
So geography really shaped the social fabric of life, and I'm sensing that religion played a central role in these rural communities.
It did. Churches weren't just for worship, they were like vital social hubs, especially for women. And in areas without established churches, families would gather for prayer meetings, Bible readings, all that provided a sense of community, shared faith.
Right, religion was more than just faith. It was a way to connect, especially in these isolated areas.
Mhm.
And I bet things like barn raisings reinforce that sense of community too.
Exactly. Neighbors coming together to help each other out. It showed that spirit of cooperation, is essential for survival. But even with all that, many farmers, they still felt the pull of the city, that promise of opportunity, the excitement.
That age-old tension between the stability of rural life and the allure of the city, something that we still grapple with today. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. A truly transformative period in American history. A nation growing, changing, facing all these challenges. America in 1860 was a totally different place than just a few decades earlier.
It really was. And it's not just about the facts and figures, right? It's about understanding how these changes affected the lives of everyday people. We've seen cities rise, industry grow, that gap between rich and poor widen. We've seen how women's roles were evolving, and that enduring human quest for leisure, for connection. These are themes that, honestly, they still resonate with us today. History isn't just a bunch of dusty old stories. It's a living tapestry, woven into the fabric of our present.
Beautifully said. And it leaves us with so much to think about. If we were to step back in time to 1860, what would shock us the most? What would we miss from our modern world? And what lessons from that era can we apply to our lives today? Lots to ponder. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into 19th century America.
Anytime. It's been a fascinating journey.